In the world of Sapulpa High School football, winning is everything.
The people that lived in Sapulpa took a lot of pride in the football program.
My dad played football for Sapulpa in 1952. I played in 1976, so it was kind of like a family tradition, I guess.
And then this tragedy hit and just kind of blew up everything.
Both coaches were missing.
From that point forward, it becomes all hands on deck.
We knew it was bad, but we didn't know what or why.
I still, to this day, have a hard time with it. It changed a lot of lives in Sapulpa. January 22nd, 1976. That was probably the darkest day in Sapulpa history, at least in my lifetime. I was late for school because I had an orthodontist appointment, and when I got to school, I went through the back doors by the cafeteria. Coach Rager was 20 feet inside the door, coming towards the door. He said hi, I said hi, and went on. Coach Bailey was with him, and he said, "Hey, you're late for school, you better get to class." And he had that smile. I said, "I'm going." That was the last time I saw either one of them.
The 70s were a unique time, a time of bell-bottoms and loud colors, platform shoes, and the like.
The 70s, yeah, they were different for sure. Hair's a little long, a lot longer than it is now. It was a fun time to grow up.
Sapulpa in the mid-70s was a blue-collar manufacturing town about 15 miles from Tulsa. We had 2 glass plants. We had a meat packing industry. It was very much a working-class town. At the end of the week, on Friday nights, where most of the town went was to the football stadium.
I lived in the country, so I didn't come to town that often, but I did get to come to the ball games and stuff like that, so football was a big deal. Most of the people in Sapulpa would come with their families and support the team, and it was a fun time, but it had its points that there were some hard times too.
During the early to mid-70s, there was anti-war demonstrations. You had the Watergate issue going on, and there was a lot of nationwide unrest that we saw. I think for Sapulpa's, Friday night was time you could forget about it.
It was a social interaction. You were there to support the team, but it was also a chance to socialize with people. It was really a source of pride for the entire community.
It was just a normal morning. I was in the teacher's workroom getting ready for the day, and someone stuck their head in and said, "Could you all help us look around? Coach Bailey is missing." Jerry Bailey was the head football coach. Jerry was also a teacher. All coaches have to teach, at least they did then, and first hour had started and he wasn't in his class, and so that seemed really odd.
I had Coach Bailey's second hour for science class, but Coach Bailey wasn't there. No real concern, it was just more odd. He was not where he was supposed to be, so. And then I actually had Mrs. Bailey third hour, the following hour, and by that time, she had been called away.
Beverly Bailey, Jerry's wife, was a teacher at the school. There was a football player that actually walked into her classroom and said, "Hey, is Coach sick?" You know, he wasn't in class. And so she told her class to stay quiet and then walked down to the office to give Jerry a call at home to find out if maybe he had gotten sick or something had happened. Nobody answered.
You could see people scampering around and teachers asking, "Have you seen Coach Bailey? Have you seen," you know, people were looking for where he was.
And then at that point, Jerry Dean, who was also an assistant coach, came in and said, "Hey, have you seen Jerry or Rager?" Paul Rieger Jr. was also an assistant coach as well as assistant principal at Sapulpa. At that point, they had realized that both coaches weren't where they were supposed to be.
When we learned they were both gone, everybody was getting a little worried.
At that point, the administration decided to call the police.
We had two coaches that were missing, two respected members of the Sapulpa community. It becomes all hands on deck. From that point forward, the police became very much involved with finding out as much as I could about those two gentlemen.
Jerry Bailey grew up in Broken Bow, Oklahoma. Very, very athletic. He attended Southeastern State, and he was playing college football. That's when he realized he really wanted to go into coaching. He wanted to be a teacher, and he wanted to coach. After graduating college, he landed at Nowata High School. In 1970, his second year at Nowata, they ended up winning the Class 2A state championship. At that time, Sapulpa was looking for a new coach. So they had their sights set on Jerry Bailey. That's who they wanted, and they went out and got him.
Jerry came in 71, I believe. When Jerry was hired, the hope was that he could take Sapulpa to a state championship. Our last state title was, I think, in 1958.
Coach Bailey came in fresh off a state championship at Nowata, so hopes at Sapulpa were, you know, big. Like, he's gonna turn this around. I was a 16-year-old sophomore in 1976. Coach Bailey was a really good motivator. He always pushed you to do better. Always had a smile. I mean, he, you know, always had time to talk to you.
He put his players first, and he wanted the best for them. I think he was everything you could want in a head football coach.
You talk about someone that the whole town knew, it was Coach Bailey. When it was lunchtime, people got to mingling and people started putting things together. Hey, Coach Rager's no longer here. Coach Bailey's not here. We knew that something was wrong.
Everybody was beginning to get worried at that point when they hadn't been found, and you could see the worry in the teachers too, that something's not right and that they knew something was up.
There was speculation that maybe there had been a car accident somewhere. This was pre-cell phone days, so there was no way, if there had been a problem, they could have called and notified anyone. By early afternoon, I think the worry ceased to be worry and was real concern that something terrible must have happened, because if it had been a car accident, word would have gotten back to the school.
It was puzzling.
The coaches were last seen in Paul Rager's car, which was an older model Chevy Caprice. The police put out an APB on Rager's car.
With the two coaches missing, it was unusual, but to be perfectly candid with you, I wasn't suspecting that there'd be foul play until they found something miles up the road.
They had found some bloody papers on the side of the road.
The bloody papers had Jerry's name on them. That's about the time it started getting real for Sapulpa.
Many officers participated in the search of the two coaches. It became fairly obvious that when papers were found, there must be some foul play involved. And hopefully they're both still alive. But obviously we didn't know what in the world happened to them. When papers were found that belonged to Jerry Bailey that had blood on them, from that point forward, the investigation really began.
The bloody papers that the police found. They were about 30 miles from Sapulpa.
Officers searched around where those papers were found with the blood on them. But there was no other person around, no other cars around, no anything.
Coach Bailey always carried a clipboard with him. So when that rumor started going around that they had found his clipboard and his bloody papers, I knew something wasn't right, but didn't know what and didn't dare imagine what had happened. When the school day was over, there was fear that there was something really wrong going on.
It could be a third or a fourth individual that perhaps attempted to kidnap them or do harm to them.
You know, in the absence of information, there were some rumors going around.
None of us knew why there might have been anybody that might have otherwise felt the need to engage in some kind of foul play. But one of the rumors at the time was that it had to do with the unmet expectations of the football team.
When Coach Bailey came to take over, one of the things that I think excited people is that he had a state championship under his belt at Nowata. They were hoping that he'd be able to replicate that at Sapulpa.
But we lost a lot.
Jerry Bailey was at Sapulpa for 5 years. And in those 5 years, he only had one winning season.
Some people were very upset. They felt like he was hired to get this program somewhere, and he hadn't done it.
Oklahoma high school football is a lot like Texas high school football. Fans are crazy about it. People would do a lot of crazy things for football, even murder.
Coach Bailey resigned in December of 1975. So at the end of 1976, he was going to take a job somewhere else.
There were lots of rumors at the time. Some people believed it was put upon him by the administration. He was pushed out.
Winning is everything. It just is. In the world of Sapulpa High School football, if you don't win, your fans, they're ready for you to move on too.
I'm sure there were people in the community that may have laid the entire responsibility of our poor performance on Coach Bailey, but the season was over and Coach Bailey had already resigned, so it just didn't make any sense.
One of the biggest rumors was that maybe something bad had happened that was connected to Coach Rager.
Coach Rager was the offensive line coach. 1975 was Coach Rager's first year at Sapulpa.
Paul Rager Jr. was an assistant coach at Okmulgee High School, which is just down Highway 75 from Sapulpa. Paul Rieger was an exceptional student athlete in high school. Got a scholarship to play football at Langston University. There, he was captain of the football team and class president. So he was a leader. People looked up to him. Bailey saw something in Rieger and said, I want this guy on my coaching staff.
After Jerry Bailey announced his resignation, everyone was speculating about who would succeed him. And many people assumed that it would be someone already on staff as an assistant coach.
And I think many people immediately assumed that Paul Rieger would get the job because Paul Rieger and Jerry Bailey were good friends. But at that time, I don't think everyone in the Sapulpa was ready for a black head coach.
Frankly, there were some racial tensions within the school and within the community. The majority of the population was white. I think that most of the people in town tried to strive to create a sense of unity, but from time to time, there was some strife between different groups within the city.
As far as Sapulpa and race relations in the 1970s, it actually goes back further than that. In 1960, there was a tornado that pretty much decimated the black part of town in Sapulpa.
The black community was up on North Heights Hill, and that's where the black high school was that was destroyed by the 1960 tornado.
That actually forced integration because they needed a place to go to school. And so they actually integrated Sapulpa before the Civil Rights Act. So I don't think a lot of people were ready for that.
The buses came in and a bunch of crazy white kids went out and threw rocks at the black kids coming in.
And that caused tensions to grow and to build. And it even built into the 1970s. And in the mid-70s, there were actually some race riots at the high school. When Coach Bailey was hired in 1971, some of the black players had stopped playing on the football team. They were really sick of the way that they were being treated, and they just didn't want to play anymore. But Jerry decided whenever he got the job that he was gonna go out and he was gonna recruit those black players to play, and he did that. I think he felt like the best way to bring positive change in race relations in Sapulpa was through football.
That particular year, the very first lunch that we had, Coach Bailey let everybody sit wherever they sat, and people sit by their closest friends, and he basically came in and he said, hey guys, mix it up. You guys need to sit with people that you don't normally sit with. Maybe they were of a different color, maybe they were a different ethnicity, but at the end of the day, he said, look, we're gonna be a team, we gotta be in this together.
I know this, when you're doing grass drills or running sprints or it's 104 degrees in August, you're the same. Everybody's, suffering.
I don't think I ever heard anybody that was concerned about Coach Rieger coming onto the staff. But I obviously look at things from a very tunnel vision perspective of who I am and where I grew up. There were people in the town that were divisive by nature. They had grown up in racial segregation, and they did not adapt well to the changing times.
Coach Rieger and Coach Bailey ran around together. They were friends. I think that was a problem for some people.
Both coaches had remained unaccounted for through the end of the day. It had been reported that there was a pretty significant number of people that volunteered to go out and look for the whereabouts for both men.
I know a lot of the community, and we did know that law enforcement was looking for them, and people in the community, and teachers and the other coaches.
My dad had told me that evening that you know, they were still missing. I think every thought of where could they be, it was later on that I found out exactly what had happened. And I still, to this day, have a hard time with it. It changed a lot of lives.
A helicopter pilot was actually helping in the search. The helicopter had a helicopter pilot, but also 2 television news crew reporters in there. And they basically were circling around Bixby, which is mainly farmland. It was basically a big field that had a lot of grass and weeds that had grown up pretty high.
The area at that time was open fields. No apartments, no buildings whatsoever. It was just like farmland. And so when they looked for the car, that was a needle in the haystack.
We came to school the next morning, and by that time they had substitute teachers in the classroom. No one had been found. We knew it was bad, but we didn't know what or why.
That Friday, almost nothing got done at school. No one could keep their mind on the lesson. That's all anyone talked about was, where do you think they are? What do you think has happened?
We imagined the worst, from a kidnapping to something else.
You know, you get to thinking, both your coaches are missing. Are they going to take some of the players? Or we had no idea what was going on.
Mid-morning on Friday, as they were flying in the Bixby area, one of the TV news reporters saw something.
There was a old farmhouse at 131st and 145th East Avenue in the Bixby area, or close by Bixby, where those papers were found with the blood on them. This was several miles up the road from Pulp High School.
They circled around the abandoned farmhouse, and then that's when they saw Rager's car. The car was actually parked in a place where you couldn't see it from the road. And so there were several people that were searching for the coaches that had driven by the farmhouse, but were not able to see the car. You could only see the car from up high. So they were able to find a place where they could land. And when they did land, they checked the license plate on the car, and it was correct. It was Rager's car. But they didn't know where the coaches were. The car appeared to be abandoned, and there was nobody around.
The missing car that was occupied by Paul Rager and Jerry Bailey when they left the high school was discovered by a news reporter, and at that point he contacted law enforcement from various agencies to come to the scene.
And one of those people was Oklahoma State Trooper Kent Thompson, who was one of Bailey's good friends. They were very, very tight. So he hightailed it over to the farmhouse.
As he approached the car, he saw that there appeared to be smeared blood on the rear bumper of the vehicle.
Unfortunately, they could not get into the trunk. The car was locked. But he also noticed that the keys were still in the ignition. He did not want to destroy any evidence. So busting the window really wasn't an option. At that time, you could pop the lock by kind of jiggling the handle to make that lock pop up. The state trooper was able to get the keys from the ignition, and then he walked back to the trunk. Could it be Rager? Could it be Bailey? Could it be both coaches?
It
At that juncture, the member of law enforcement that was out at the crime scene opened the trunk of the car.
Trooper Thompson had to kind of prepare himself for what he could possibly find. One of his best friends was missing, and I think that the state trooper knew that if he opened that trunk, he could find someone inside of it. And that's when he saw the body. It was Jerry Bailey's body.
There were multiple wounds involved, which appeared to be stab wounds from a knife. The number of wounds, to me, would indicate anger, extreme anger.
The police noticed that his shirt had been raised, and it was almost like Jerry was trying to feel where his injuries were and how bad they were. And then after that, I'm assuming he just put his hand under his chin and then just fell asleep. So now the investigators had to figure out, are we gonna find Coach Rager in the same way? Is it gonna be worse?
And at that point, more law enforcement was notified, and they went to the crime scene. There were multiple officers from multiple departments. And because of the venue where the body was found, that became a Tulsa County Sheriff's Department jurisdiction.
And so now they were focused on finding Rager. They had looked everywhere around the car for Rager, but he wasn't there. And I think at that point, the helicopter pilot decided to check the farmhouse. And it was an old, dirty, almost dilapidated farmhouse that had not been lived in years. There was dirt all over the floors, the windows were busted out. There was just a very creepy feeling inside the house. And after he checked every room, there was one room left that he needed to check. And he walked up to the door, opened it slightly, looked in, and noticed that there was a large black man laying on a mattress. He had blood on his shirt. He looked like he was in bad shape.
An individual from the sheriff's office knew the name and said loudly, "Paul Rager." And at that point, his eyes opened. He was still alive.
Medical personnel are there, the police are there, and they noticed that he has blood on his shirt. But at that point, they didn't know what injuries he had. They were asking him questions, if he was hurt, what had happened. He was not able to communicate. He just was mumbling, staring off into space. He just was almost catatonic. And so police didn't know what was going on.
On that day, we were scheduled to start a wrestling tournament at our high school at 1 o'clock. At that point, the football season has been over with for, 2.5 months. And some players were in basketball, some were in wrestling. And I was with the guys that were wrestling. I actually was on the mat and had just shaken hands with the guy who was getting ready to wrestle. And they came over the loudspeaker and announced that they were postponing the wrestling meet and for all of the Sapulpa wrestlers to go to the locker room. Coach Shibley, the wrestling coach, told us that Coach Bailey had been murdered and Coach Rager was found and in need of medical treatment. Coach Shibley was very emotional, as we all were. How could something like this happen?
I remember the moon landing and I remember JFK's assassination. And we'll never forget either one of those. And I also will never forget Jerry Bailey's death.
It was really emotional. There were a lot of tears all through the school. Coach Bailey touched a lot of lives, and it was just really a bad day.
The football players were devastated, all of them. I know Sapulpa was like any normal school until this tragedy hit and just kind of blew up everything.
The police personnel and investigators at the farmhouse start checking Rager out for injuries and started noticing that something wasn't right. His hands and his fingers have some small cuts on them, but nothing substantial. None of it made sense. The blood that's on his clothes couldn't possibly come from the little injuries on his hands. That's more than likely someone else's blood.
An officer from Sapulpa says, "Mr. Rieger," and before he even said anything else, Rieger says something that would leave the community in deep shock.
All of us were hearing it over the loudspeaker for the first time. Coach Rager had been found alive, but Coach Bailey had been found dead. And I don't think any of us knew at the time what the situation was specifically with Coach Rager. It became apparent later, of course.
At some point, police determined that blood came from the deceased Jerry Bailey. An officer from Sapulpa says, "Mr. Rieger," and Rieger interrupted the officer and said, answered before being asked a question, "I guess what I did was wrong."
Rager said that the two coaches were actually driving down Mingo Road, headed towards the farmhouse. And that's when Rager said he needed to pull over and show Bailey something in the trunk.
Then Jerry gets out of the car, but when Bailey gets to the back of the car in the rear bumper, Rieger pulls a butcher knife out from under the seat of his car that he had there from 2 to 3 weeks before.
And that's when the attack happened. Rager admitted to killing his best friend, Jerry Bailey. The police officer point blank asked Rager why he did it.
And Rieger responded, Jerry was quote unquote messing him around.
When Coach Bailey resigned in December, they hired Art Davis, who coached at Sapulpa in the 50s.
Mr. Rieger felt that Jerry Bailey had messed him around in terms of his recommendation or lack thereof for him to take over the position of head coach at Sapulpa High School when Jerry had resigned.
Rager's motivation for killing Coach Bailey was he didn't get the head coaching job. Senseless.
Medical examiner's report indicated when he did the autopsy that he discovered 21 stab wounds, 7 of which could be fatal.
You know, I can't imagine a more horrible way of dying. When I first heard, I was sure law enforcement got it wrong. This couldn't be, like you're saying, it's happened.
We were all doing a lot of soul searching to see if there was anything that maybe we missed. But it was certainly my belief that the two coaches were close on the job, but also close off of the job as well.
I mean, I can remember Beverly telling me at one time that her kids would spend the night with them, their kids would spend the night with her. I mean, they were good friends.
I had never really seen anything that would make me think that there was a concern in the relationship between the two of them that would lead to something that tragic.
I do remember Coach Bailey's funeral. Not only did it take up the entire congregational area in the First Baptist Church, but it also went into the overflow facility, which was their prior auditorium. So both of those were completely filled with people attending the service live, and it was broadcast live over the radio in the town of Sapulpa.
The biggest funeral I think Sapulpa's ever seen. It was so big that there was probably twice as many people outside the church as inside, if not more.
The entire team, were honorary pallbearers. I was just, overwhelmed by how many people came and how much people cared about him.
On the day of Jerry Bailey's funeral, Paul Rager is charged with second-degree murder.
He admitted that he put the butcher knife under the seat of his car 2 to 3 weeks before. So that becomes a matter of premeditation. And in nowadays, it would be first-degree murder, but under the old law, it was not. Paul Rager pled not guilty to the charges through his lawyer. They didn't deny that the act took place, just that he was psychotic at the time, temporary insane, didn't know the difference between right and wrong.
So the judge orders the psych evaluation, and Paul Rager is in and out of mental institutions.
I mean, for somebody to do what he did, you're not all there.
In 1977, Paul Rager finally goes to trial, and his defense is trying to say that he was insane at the time of the murder. However, the prosecution contends that he knew exactly what he was doing.
The way it was kind of described was that every time it was time for the trial to come up, that he would go temporarily insane.
When the jury retired to deliberate on the case, they came back 90 minutes later with their verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Paul Rager Jr., guilty of the crime of second-degree murder, period.
Most of us who knew Coach Bailey felt a sense of relief when we knew that the trial had taken place and that there was a guilty verdict.
Rager was then sentenced 10 years to life, and he was supposed to start serving the sentence almost immediately. But then he actually filed an appellate bond, which back then you could be out while your case was on appeal. And the day before he was supposed to start serving his 10 years to life sentence, he died of natural causes.
Coach Rager never spent any time in jail whatsoever for the crime that he was convicted of. At the same time, we know that Coach Rager lost his family in his life, and there was a tremendous price that he paid as well.
It was a tragedy for both families, not just one. I know that for Mrs. Bailey, it was a horrible tragedy for her, but for Coach Rager's wife and children, I can only imagine the sadness and embarrassment, and it is sad that he didn't serve some type of time, but you know what? Sometimes guilt will get you in the end. You just never know.
There aren't just a great number of us adults still around who remember it clearly, but the students do, and it's still an open wound in a way to them.
I kind of felt like, winning cures all evils, basically, and had we played better, had we been a better team, Coach Bailey may not have been leaving. And had we won more ball games, maybe this doesn't happen.
Jerry Bailey's story isn't just about his murder. And it's not just about football either. It's about the impact that he had on the Sapulpa community, whether it was race relations, football, or he was an amazing teacher as well. I mean, it's been almost 50 years since the murder, and these players to this day still talk about how much love they have for Jerry Bailey.
I mean, just seeing the memorial homage to Coach Bailey, it's very comforting and gratifying to see that the community hasn't forgotten about him.
This is the part where I try not to be emotional, but an old saying, it said that a good coach can change a game, but a great coach can change a life. And Coach Bailey was a great coach.
My daughter went to a party last night, and she disappeared this morning.
The New Year's Eve party was the last time anybody saw Valerie alive.
The killer's out there somewhere. Everyone was a suspect.
There was a lot of football players at that party. Someone was getting away with murder.